The hot, Montana sun beat down mercilessly as Levi Morgan rode toward the horizon, his heart as heavy as the saddlebags slung across his stallion. Behind him lay Sweetwater Creek, the only place he'd ever called home, and Charlotte Davis, the woman he'd loved since they were children playing by the creek that gave the town its name. It was June 1875, and Levi had just watched Charlotte marry Henry Blackwood, the wealthiest rancher in the county. His own proposal had come too late, after he'd spent years saving for a ranch worthy of her. By then, practical Charlotte had already accepted Henry's offer, believing Levi would never settle down from his wandering ways. "I'll make something of myself," Levi whispered to the wind as his horse crested the ridge. "And someday, I'll come back." The promise hung in the air like the dust kicked up by his horse's hooves, but even as he made it, Levi wondered if he'd ever find the courage to return. 5 years later, Levi Morgan stood at the entrance to the Silver Dollar Saloon in Billings, Montana Territory. At 32, he had transformed from the impulsive young wrangler who'd left Sweetwater Creek into a successful cattle broker whose name carried weight throughout the Montana Territory. His dark hair was longer now, reaching his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard covered the lower half of his face. His eyes, though they remained the same piercing blue that had once made Charlotte Davis blush whenever he looked her way. "Mr. Morgan," the saloon owner, a round man named Peterson, hurried forward. "Didn't expect to see you until next month's cattle auction." Levi nodded cordially. "Just passing through, Peterson, heading south." "South? You heading to Sweetwater Creek by any chance?" Peterson's expression grew solemn. "Heard about old Henry Blackwood's passing last winter. Terrible business with that pneumonia." Levi's hand froze around his whiskey glass. "Henry Blackwood is dead. Going on 6 months now. Left his widow with that big ranch and a heap of trouble, from what I hear. Those Blackwood brothers of his aren't exactly making things easy for her." Levi set his glass down, the amber liquid untouched. "Charlotte is a widow." Peterson nodded, pouring himself a drink. "Mrs. Charlotte Blackwood, running that spread all on her own now. Heard she's had to let go half the hands because the brothers are contesting the will." That night, Levi lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling. Charlotte was free. The thought hammered at him relentlessly. But what right did he have to ride back into her life after 5 years of silence? He'd never written, never sent word. His pride had been too wounded, his heart too broken. By morning, Levi had made his decision. He would ride to Sweetwater Creek, not to court Charlotte, but simply to help an old friend in need. If she turned him away, he would respect her wishes. But he had to see her again, had to know if the spark that had once burned between them had been completely extinguished. 3 days later, Levi rode into Sweetwater Creek. The town had grown in his absence, with new buildings lining Main Street and a proper railway station where the old stagecoach stop had been. As he passed the general store, he noticed curious glances from townsfolk who recognized him despite the years. The Blackwood Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling property that had nearly doubled in size since Levi had left. As he approached the main house, he saw a woman in a simple blue dress standing on the porch, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical bun. Even from a distance, he recognized Charlotte's straight-backed posture and the purposeful way she moved. She didn't see him at first, busy instructing a young ranch hand about something. When she turned and spotted the rider approaching, she shaded her eyes against the sun. Levi saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Her body went perfectly still. He dismounted, removing his hat as he walked toward the porch. "Hello, Charlotte," Levi Morgan. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, though perhaps a touch deeper with maturity. "You're the last person I expected to see riding up my drive. I heard about Henry. I'm sorry for your loss." Charlotte's green eyes studied him, betraying nothing of her thoughts. "Thank you. It's been difficult." An awkward silence fell between them, 5 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. "I also heard you might be having some trouble with the ranch," Levi finally said. News travels fast. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. Henry's brothers think a woman can't run this place. They're trying to force me to sell to them for a fraction of its worth. And what do you think? I think they're underestimating me. The spark of determination in her eyes was new, or perhaps it had always been there, and he'd been too young to see it. But I won't pretend it's been easy. Levi replaced his hat, squinting at the sprawling pastures beyond the house. I've learned a thing or two about ranching since I left. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Why would you want to help me, Levi? You rode away without a backward glance 5 years ago. The accusation stung, but he couldn't deny its truth. I've changed, Charlotte. And regardless of our past, I can't ride away knowing you're fighting this battle alone. She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded toward the house. Come inside. We can discuss it over coffee. Inside, the Blackwood home was elegant but practical, much like Charlotte herself. She poured them both coffee and sat across from him at the kitchen table. Up close, Levi could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the subtle silver strands in her honey-colored hair. She was still beautiful, perhaps more so than when he'd left, but there was a weariness about her that hadn't been there before. Tell me what's happening with the ranch, he said after taking a sip of the strong coffee. Charlotte sighed, cradling her cup. Henry left everything to me. The ranch, the cattle, the accounts, all of it. His brothers, James and William, were furious. They'd always assumed they'd inherit at least part of it. They have no legal claim. None. Henry's will was clear. But they've been making trouble, spreading rumors in town that I can't manage the place, telling the hands they won't get paid, even rustling some of my cattle. She set her cup down with a decisive click. I've lost 3 good ranch hands who believed their lies about my financial situation. Levi frowned. Have you gone to the sheriff? Sheriff Davis doesn't have proof it was them taking the cattle, and as for the rest... She shrugged. It's not illegal to spread rumors. How many hands do you have left? 4, plus Miguel the foreman. She gestured toward the window where the young man Levi had seen earlier was visible in the yard. Henry trusted him, and so do I. Levi took another sip of coffee, thinking, I've built some connections in the cattle business. I could help you get fair prices for your herd come fall. And until then, I could lend a hand around here. Charlotte's eyes flickered with suspicion. You're offering to work as a ranch hand? You, Levi Morgan, who couldn't wait to leave Sweetwater Creek behind? I'm offering to help an old friend, he said quietly. Nothing more, nothing less. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I could use the help, but I'll pay you fair wages, same as any other hand, and you'll answer to Miguel like everyone else. Agreed. He extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Her palm was calloused now, no longer the soft hand of the girl he'd once known. I'll start tomorrow. As he rode to town to secure a room at the boarding house, Levi knew he was treading dangerous ground. 5 years hadn't diminished his feelings for Charlotte, if anything. Seeing her again, strong and determined despite her circumstances, had only deepened them. But she was still grieving Henry, still finding her footing as a widow and a ranch owner. The last thing she needed was complications from a man from her past. He would help her save the ranch, and then he would ride away again. It was the honorable thing to do. This time, though, he would leave knowing he'd done right by her. The next morning, Levi arrived at the Blackwood Ranch just after sunrise. Miguel, a stocky man in his early 30s with a serious demeanor, was already assigning tasks to the other hands. Mrs. Blackwood says you'll be joining us, Miguel said, his tone neutral but his eyes assessing. You know ranch work? I grew up on a small spread east of here, Levi replied, and I've worked with cattle brokers all through the territory since then. Miguel nodded. We're mending the north fence line today. Someone cut it in 3 places last night, the Blackwood brothers. Miguel's expression darkened. Cannot prove it. But who else would gain from our cattle wandering onto open range? The day was long and hard. the Montana summer sun beating down as they repaired fence after fence. By midday, Levi's muscles were aching from the familiar but long-neglected labor. He worked alongside the other hands, a laconic older man called Hank, two brothers named Tom and Jack Fletcher, and a young half-Crow man who went by the name of Charlie. They were a close-knit crew, loyal to Charlotte, but clearly worried about the ranch's future. Over a lunch of beans and hardtack, Levi listened as they discussed the latest troubles. Blackwood brothers were in town yesterday, Hank said, spooning beans into his mouth. Telling anyone who'd listen that Mrs. Blackwood's going to have to sell by summer's end. She ain't selling, Charlie said firmly. She told us so. Not willingly, Tom Fletcher added, but if they keep rustling cattle and sabotaging the operation, she might not have a choice. Mrs. Blackwood is stronger than they think, Miguel said with quiet conviction. And we will help her prove it. The men nodded, and Levi found himself impressed by their loyalty. He wondered what kind of woman Charlotte had become to inspire such devotion. The girl he'd known had been kind and gentle, but this ranch required a leader of steel. Late that afternoon, as they were riding back to the main house, Levi caught sight of Charlotte herself, riding out to check on a pregnant heifer. She sat astride her horse with easy confidence, her skirts modified for riding. The sight of her silhouetted against the setting sun made his heart constrict painfully. She rides out every day, Miguel said, noticing Levi's gaze. Checks every part of the ranch herself. The men respect that. Henry taught her. Miguel shook his head. She learned on her own, after he fell ill last year. Before that, she mainly kept to the house. But when he could not ride anymore, she took it upon herself to learn his duties. Levi absorbed this information, adding it to his growing understanding of the woman Charlotte had become. So different from the girl he'd left behind, and yet somehow exactly as he'd always known she could be strong, determined, resilient. Days turned into weeks as June melted into July. Levi fell into the rhythm of ranch life, rising before dawn, working until dusk, taking his meals with the other hands. He saw Charlotte daily, but their interactions remained formal, limited to discussions about ranch business. If she sometimes caught him watching her with a softness in his eyes, she gave no indication of it. One evening in mid-July, Levi was repairing a broken stall in the barn when Charlotte appeared in the doorway, a lantern in her hand. "You're working late," she observed, hanging the lantern on a hook. "Thought I'd finish this before turning in," he replied, hammering a nail into place. She watched him work for a moment, then said, "You've been a real help these past weeks, Levi. The men trust you. They're good men." "Loyal to you." "Yes," she agreed, running a hand along the smooth wood of the stall door. "Henry chose them well." At the mention of her late husband, Levi paused in his work. "You must miss him." Charlotte's expression grew distant. "Henry was a good man, kind, fair." She hesitated, then added softly, "We had a companionable marriage." Something in her tone made Levi glance up. But not a passionate one. As soon as the words left his mouth, he regretted them. It wasn't his place to ask such things, but Charlotte didn't seem offended. "No," she admitted quietly. "Not passionate, we were. Friends who married. He knew she stopped abruptly, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter now." Levi set his hammer down, giving her his full attention. "He knew what, Charlotte?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment, he saw a flash of the young woman he'd once known vulnerable, honest. "He knew I had given my heart to someone else long ago, someone who rode away." The words hung between them, charged with meaning. Levi's heart hammered in his chest. "Charlotte, but she was already backing toward the door, composure restored. "It's late. I should let you finish your work." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the gentle sway of the lantern light and the lingering scent of lavender in her wake. The following Sunday, Levi rode into town for supplies. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed two men watching him from across the street, both in their 40s, with the same stocky build and hard eyes. The Blackwood brothers, he guessed. Inside the store, the shopkeeper, Mrs. Winters greeted him warmly. "Mr. Morgan, good to see you around these parts again. Heard you're helping out at the Blackwood place." "That's right," Levi confirmed, handing her his list of supplies. "Mighty kind of you. That poor woman's had a rough go of it since Henry passed." Mrs. Winters began gathering his items. "Those brothers-in-law of hers aren't making things any easier." "So I've heard." Mrs. Winters leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "Just last week, James Blackwood was in here telling folks Charlotte's going to lose the ranch by harvest time. Said a woman has no business running a spread that size." "Mrs. Blackwood seems to be managing just fine," Levi said evenly. "Oh, I think so too. Always did have a good head on her shoulders, even as a girl." Mrs. Winters smiled knowingly. "I remember when you two were sweet on each other before you left town." Levi felt a flush creep up his neck. "That was a long time ago, Mrs. Winters." "Maybe so, but the heart remembers what the mind tries to forget." She patted his hand. "Just you be careful around those Blackwood boys. They're not men to cross lightly." As if summoned by her warning, the door opened, and James and William Blackwood entered the store. They paused when they saw Levi, exchanging a look that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Well, if it isn't the prodigal cowboy returned," James said, his voice carrying through the store. "Heard you've been playing ranch hand-out at Henry's place." "Mrs. Blackwood's place," Levi corrected mildly. William snorted. "Not for much longer. That spread's been in the Blackwood family for 30 years. No widow's going to keep it from its rightful owners." Levi turned to face them fully. "The law says differently." James stepped closer, his expression darkening. "You do well to mind your own business, Morgan. Charlotte might have fooled Henry with her pretty face, but she's in over her head now. Best thing she could do is sell to us and move back to town where she belongs." "Or maybe," Levi suggested, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest, "the best thing would be for you two to respect your brother's wishes and leave his widow in peace." "You always did have a soft spot for her," William sneered. "Even back when she chose Henry over you." "What's the matter, Morgan? Still pining after another man's leavings?" Levi's fists clenched at his sides. Mrs. Winters, sensing the tension, hurried forward. "Now, gentlemen, this is a place of business. I'll thank you to conduct yourselves accordingly." James held Levi's gaze for a long moment, then stepped back with a cold smile. "We'll be seeing you around, Morgan. Count on it." After they'd left, Mrs. Winters shook her head. "Nasty pieces of work, those two. Been worse since Henry died. Always jealous of what he built, if you ask me." Levi paid for his supplies, his mind troubled. The Blackwood brothers weren't just making idle threats, they truly intended to force Charlotte off the ranch. And from the look in James's eye, they wouldn't be too particular about their methods. That night, Levi sat with Miguel outside the bunkhouse, sharing the information he'd gathered in town. "They're getting bolder," Miguel observed, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. "Last week, they approached Charlie in the saloon, offered him money to accidentally leave the west gate open." "Did he take it?" Miguel's expression was grim. "Charlie is loyal. He told them where they could put their money." He lit his cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face. "But they will try again with someone else, or they will take more direct action." "We need to be prepared," Levi agreed. "Double the watch on the herd, especially at night. Already done, but we are few and the ranch is large." Levi stared out at the darkened landscape, thinking, "The cattle auction in Billings is in 3 weeks. If we can get the herd there safely, Mrs. Blackwood will have enough money to hire more hands and make it through winter." Miguel nodded slowly. 3 weeks is not so long to hold out." "No," Levi agreed, "but it's going to feel like an eternity if the Blackwoods keep up their campaign." The next morning, Levi rode out with Charlotte to check the western pasture where the main herd grazed. She was dressed in a split riding skirt and a crisp white shirtwaist, her hair braided and pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Riding beside her, Levi couldn't help but admire the confidence with which she handled her horse, a spirited bay mare. "Miguel tells me you're concerned about the Blackwoods making a move before the auction." she said, as they crested a rise overlooking the valley. They made their intentions pretty clear in town yesterday. Charlotte's jaw tightened. They've always underestimated me. Henry's little wife, they called me, even to my face. She turned to look at him, her eyes fierce. I won't let them take what's mine, Levi. This ranch is all I have. You have more than you know, he said quietly. You have loyal hands who'd ride through fire for you. You have skills and determination that would put most men to shame. A hint of color touched her cheeks at his words. And I have you, she said softly. For now, at least. The qualification hung between them, a reminder that his presence was temporary. Levi wanted to tell her that he'd stay as long as she needed him, that he'd never leave her again if she asked him to stay. But the time wasn't right, not with the threat of the Blackwoods looming over them, not with the wound of Henry's death still fresh. Instead, he said, let's check the herd. I want to make sure they're all accounted for before we move them north next week. They spent the morning riding among the cattle, counting heads and checking for signs of illness. The herd looked healthy and strong, nearly 200 head of prime beef cattle that would fetch top dollar at the Billings auction. It represented not just Charlotte's immediate security, but the future of the ranch itself. As they were preparing to ride back, Charlotte suddenly reined in her horse, pointing toward a ridge to the east. Riders. Levi followed her gaze and saw 3 horsemen silhouetted against the sky. Even at this distance, he recognized the broad-shouldered outline of James Blackwood. They're watching us, Charlotte said, her voice tight. Counting the herd, most likely. Let them look, Levi replied. They can't take what they can't get to. But as they rode back to the ranch house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Blackwoods were planning something. 3 weeks suddenly seemed like a very long time indeed. That night, a summer storm rolled in from the mountains, bringing with it sheets of rain and jagged forks of lightning that illuminated the ranch in brief, eerie flashes. Levi lay awake in the bunkhouse, listening to the thunder and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Something felt wrong, a prickling at the back of his neck that he'd learned over the years to trust. He was just considering getting up to check the barn when the door burst open. Charlie stood there, drenched and wild-eyed. Fire, he shouted. The north barn is burning. Levi was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots as Miguel and the others scrambled to do the same. They raced out into the storm, toward the orange glow that was visible even through the curtain of rain. The north barn, where they stored hay for the winter, was already engulfed in flames. Charlotte was there, hair plastered to her face by the rain, shouting orders as ranch hands formed a bucket brigade from the well. The horses, she cried when she saw Levi. There are still 3 inside. Without hesitation, Levi ran toward the burning structure. The heat hit him like a wall as he entered, the smoke immediately making his eyes water and his lungs burn. He could hear the terrified whinnying of horses somewhere ahead. He found them in the back stalls, rearing and kicking in panic. Working quickly, he managed to get halters on 2 of them, leading them toward the door where Miguel waited to take them. The third, a young stallion, was too frantic to approach. Come on, boy, Levi urged, reaching for the horse's halter. We need to get out of here. A burning beam crashed down nearby, sending up a shower of sparks. The stallion reared, eyes rolling in terror. Levi ducked under a hoof, barely avoiding being struck, and managed to grab the halter. With a firm hand, he led the frightened animal toward the door, covering his mouth with his shirt as the smoke thickened. They burst out into the rain-soaked night, just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. Hands took the stallion from him as Levi doubled over, coughing and gasping for air. Are you all right? Charlotte was at his side, her face streaked with soot and concern. He nodded, unable to speak through his coughing. She supported him as they moved away from the burning barn toward the relative shelter of the main house porch. It wasn't the lightning, she said grimly once they were out of the rain. Miguel found a broken lantern near the back door and boot prints too big to be any of our men. The Blackwoods, Levi rasped, his throat raw from smoke. Charlotte's eyes hardened. They could have killed my horses, killed my men. She looked at him, her expression fierce. Killed you. But they didn't, he said, reaching for her hand. We're all safe. She gripped his fingers tightly, and for a moment, they simply stood together, watching as the rain and the men's efforts finally began to subdue the flames. I should get back, Charlotte said after a while, releasing his hand reluctantly. There's still work to be done. Levi nodded, watching her walk back into the rain, her back straight and her head held high despite the night's disaster. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he loved her, not just the memory of the girl she had been, but the woman she had become. Strong, resilient, unbroken by grief or hardship. And he knew with equal certainty that he would do whatever it took to protect her and the life she'd built. The fire at the North Barn was only the beginning. Over the next week, the Blackwoods' campaign of intimidation escalated. Fences were cut, cattle scattered, and a watering hole on the eastern edge of the property was fouled with oil. Each incident required time and resources to address, stretching Charlotte's small crew to its limits. Sheriff Davis rode out after the fire, but without concrete evidence linking the Blackwoods to the sabotage, his hands were tied. I know it's them, Mrs. Blackwood, he said apologetically as they stood in her front parlor. But knowing and proving are two different matters. So I'm just supposed to wait until they burn down my house with me in it? Charlotte demanded, her patience clearly fraying. The sheriff sighed, turning his hat in his hands. I'll have a word with them, warn them that I'm watching, but without witnesses or evidence. I understand, Charlotte said stiffly. Thank you for coming out, Sheriff. After he'd gone, she sank into a chair, the weight of the situation momentarily overwhelming her composed exterior. Levi, who had been standing quietly by the window, moved to sit across from her. We'll get through this, he said gently. The drive to Billings starts in 10 days. Once we sell the herd, you'll have money to hire more hands, maybe even bring in some Pinkerton men to watch the place. Charlotte looked up at him, her green eyes troubled. And what if we don't make it to Billings? What if they rustle the herd before we can move it? They won't, Levi said with more confidence than he felt. We're doubling the watch. Miguel and I are taking shifts ourselves. You can't watch forever, she pointed out. You all need sleep sometime. Levi leaned forward, taking her hands in his. Charlotte, I promised I would help you, and I meant it. We will get that herd to Billings. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a vulnerability he hadn't seen since that night in the barn. Why did you really come back, Levi? She asked quietly. The truth, this time, he hesitated, knowing his answer could change everything between them. I heard you were in trouble. I wanted to help. Is that all? Levi took a deep breath. No, I came back because even after 5 years, I couldn't stop thinking about you, because when I heard you were a widow, I thought maybe there might be a second chance for us. He shook his head. It was selfish. You were grieving. You needed help, not complications. And now, her voice was barely above a whisper. Now I know that I never stopped loving you, Charlotte, not for a single day since I rode away. The words, finally spoken aloud after being held in his heart for so long, felt both terrifying and liberating. She was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hands from his. I can't, Levi, not now. There's too much at stake. She stood, moving to the window. Henry's been gone less than a year. I'm fighting for my ranch, my future. I can't afford distractions. The rejection stung, but Levi understood. Rising, he nodded. I shouldn't have spoken. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for honesty, she said, still looking out the window. Just give me time. All the time you need, he promised, and left her standing there, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. That night, Levi took the first watch over the herd, riding the perimeter of the western pasture with a rifle across his saddle. The moon was nearly full, bathing the landscape in silver light that made the cattle's hides gleam like polished stone. Around midnight, Charlie rode up to relieve him. Anything? The young man asked, his dark eyes scanning the quiet herd. All quiet, Levi replied. But stay sharp. I don't trust this piece. Charlie nodded, settling his hat more firmly on his head. Miguel says we move the herd north tomorrow, toward the Billings Trail. Good. The sooner we get them moving, the better. As Levi turned his horse toward the ranch house, Charlie called after him. She watches for you, you know, Mrs. Blackwood. When you're on watch, she sits by her window until you come back. Levi paused, looking back at the young man. How do you know that? Charlie shrugged. I see things, and I see how she looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. With those words hanging in the air, Charlie rode off to begin his circuit of the herd, leaving Levi to contemplate their meaning as he made his way back to the bunkhouse. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching July day. The entire crew was up before sunrise, preparing to move the herd northward. Charlotte joined them, dressed in practical riding clothes, her hair braided down her back. We'll take them as far as Cold Creek today, she instructed as they gathered for a quick breakfast. It's a long drive, but there's good grazing there and the creek hasn't dried up yet. The men nodded, finishing their coffee and mounting up. Moving 200 head of cattle was no small task, especially with their limited numbers, but they'd all done it before. Levi rode up beside Charlotte as they prepared to set out. I'll take point with Miguel if you want to ride flank. She nodded, avoiding his eyes. That's fine. They'd been on the trail for about 2 hours when Levi noticed dust on the horizon to the east. He signaled to Miguel, who squinted in that direction and frowned. Riders, the foreman confirmed. Moving fast. Levi counted 6 men approaching rapidly. Even at this distance, he recognized the lead rider as James Blackwood. Charlotte, he called, and she rode up to join them, her expression darkening when she saw the approaching riders. What do they want now? She muttered. Nothing good, Miguel replied grimly. Shall I gather the men? Charlotte nodded. Keep the herd moving. I'll deal with my brothers-in-law. Levi and Miguel exchanged concerned glances but followed her instructions, signaling to the other hands to continue driving the cattle while they rode with Charlotte to meet the Blackwoods. James Blackwood reined in his horse about 20 yards away, his brother William and 4 rough-looking men flanking him. All were armed, rifles visible in their saddle scabbards. Morning, Charlotte, James called, his tone falsely pleasant. Taking the herd out for a little exercise. You know exactly what I'm doing, James, Charlotte replied coldly. And you're trespassing on my land. James laughed, looking to his companions. Hear that, boys, her land. He turned back to Charlotte, his expression hardening. This was Blackwood land before you ever set foot on it, woman. And it'll be Blackwood land long after you're gone. Your brothers will says differently, Levi interjected, earning a glare from James. Still hiding behind your pet cowboy, I see, James sneered. Tell me, Charlotte, did you wait until Henry was cold in his grave before you took up with his wife's sweetheart, or were you two carrying on while he was still breathing? Charlotte's face flushed with anger. How dare you? Henry was your brother. And you were his wife, William added. With certain obligations that don't include running his ranch into the ground or sharing his bed with this saddle tramp. Levi's hand moved to his pistol, but Charlotte touched his arm, restraining him. What do you want, James? She demanded. Say your piece and then get off my land. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We've come to make you a final offer. $5,000 for the ranch, the herd, everything. It's more than fair considering the difficulties you've been having lately. Difficulties that you've caused, Charlotte shot back, and the answer is no. The ranch isn't for sale, not to you, not to anyone. I was afraid you'd say that. James sighed theatrically. In that case, we'll just have to take what's rightfully ours. At his signal, his men spread out, surrounding the small group. Levi and Miguel immediately moved closer to Charlotte, hands hovering near their weapons. You can't just take my cattle, Charlotte said, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. Can't we? James's smile widened. Sheriff Davis is conveniently occupied with a disturbance in town. By the time he gets your message, we'll have moved the herd to our property. And then it'll be your word against ours about who owns what. 6 against 5 aren't great odds, Levi observed quietly to Miguel. Especially with Charlotte here. Miguel nodded almost imperceptibly. We need to get her away. Before they could formulate a plan, however, James made his move. Boys, round up that herd. Anyone who interferes gets a bullet. The Blackwoods men spurred their horses toward the cattle, sending up clouds of dust as they rode. Stop them. Charlotte cried, turning her horse to follow. Charlotte, wait. Levi called, but she was already galloping after the rustlers, Miguel close behind her. Cursing, Levi drew his pistol and fired a warning shot into the air. The sound caused James and William to wheel their horses around, both drawing their own weapons. Bad move, Cowboy, James growled, leveling his pistol at Levi. In the distance, Levi could hear shouting as the ranch hands tried to prevent the rustlers from scattering the herd. Charlotte's voice rose above the commotion, calling orders to her men. You won't get away with this, Levi said, his own gun trained on James. Too many witnesses. Witnesses can have accidents, William replied coldly, especially out here where it's just us and the rattlesnakes. A gunshot rang out from the direction of the herd, followed by a woman's scream. Levi's blood ran cold. Charlotte, taking advantage of his momentary distraction, James fired. The bullet whistled past Levi's ear as he ducked, returning fire instinctively. His shot caught James in the shoulder, sending the older man reeling backward in his saddle. William fired next, the bullet grazing Levi's arm. The pain was sharp but distant as he wheeled his horse around and galloped toward the sound of the gunfire, praying he wasn't too late. The scene that greeted him was chaos. The herd had scattered in panic from the gunshots, cattle running in all directions. 2 of the rustlers were driving a portion of the herd eastward while the others exchanged gunfire with Charlotte's men from behind the cover of a rocky outcropping. And there, pinned down behind a fallen log, was Charlotte herself, Miguel's body stretched protectively beside her. Even from a distance, Levi could see the dark stain spreading across the foreman's shirt. Fury and fear propelled Levi forward. He rode hard toward Charlotte's position, firing at the rustlers to provide cover. When one raised his rifle toward Levi, Charlie appeared from nowhere, his own shot dropping the man before he could fire. Levi reached Charlotte and dismounted in one fluid motion, diving behind the log as bullets splintered the wood above his head. Miguel's hit bad, Charlotte said, her hands pressed to a wound in the foreman's side. He jumped in front of me when they started shooting. Levi checked Miguel quickly. The bullet had entered just below his ribs and his breathing was shallow. We need to get him back to the ranch. The cattle, Charlotte began. Forget the cattle, Levi interrupted. We need to get you both out of here alive. A lull in the gunfire made them both look up. Sheriff Davis and 3 deputies had arrived, their weapons drawn as they approached the rustlers' position. Thank God, Charlotte breathed. Someone must have heard the shooting and fetched the sheriff. With the arrival of the law, the rustlers surrendered quickly. The Blackwood brothers, seeing the tide turn, attempted to flee but were cut off by Hank and the Fletcher brothers, who had circled around behind them. In the aftermath, the casualties were tallied. Miguel, seriously wounded but alive, one of the rustlers dead from Charlie's shot, James Blackwood nursing a shoulder wound, and Levi himself with a bullet graze along his upper arm. Sheriff Davis personally helped load Miguel into a wagon for the journey back to the ranch, where the doctor had been summoned. I'll need statements from all of you, the sheriff said as they prepared to leave. But it's pretty clear what happened here. Cattle rustling is a hanging offense in this territory. Charlotte, who had been silent since the shooting stopped, finally spoke. Will they go to prison? The sheriff nodded grimly. The territorial judge arrives next week. With all the witnesses and evidence, I'd say the Blackwood brothers are looking at a long stay in Deer Lodge Penitentiary. Later that evening, after the doctor had treated Miguel and pronounced him likely to recover with proper care, Charlotte found Levi sitting alone on the porch steps, his bandaged arm resting on his knee. "How are you feeling?" she asked, sitting beside him. "It's just a scratch," he replied. "I've had worse from shaving." She smiled faintly at his attempt at humor, then grew serious again. "You could have been killed today, all of you could have. But we weren't, and the Blackwoods won't be troubling you anymore." Charlotte nodded, looking out at the darkening landscape. The hands had managed to recover most of the scattered cattle, though some would likely take days to round up. "Miguel saved my life," she said quietly. "He saw the gun and just moved, didn't even hesitate. He's loyal to you, they all are." She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "And you, what makes you risk your life for me, Levi?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Levi met her gaze steadily. "I think you know the answer to that, Charlotte." "Tell me anyway," she whispered. "I need to hear it." Levi reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "I love you. I never stopped loving you, not since we were kids skipping stones in Sweetwater Creek. I rode away because I was too proud to watch you marry another man, but my heart stayed right here with you." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. "I made a practical choice when I married Henry. He offered security, stability, things you couldn't promise then." She squeezed his hand. "He was a good husband, and I grew to care for him deeply, but he knew. He always knew that my heart belonged to a cowboy who rode away." Levi's throat tightened with emotion. "Charlotte, when Henry was dying," she continued, her voice barely audible, "he made me promise something. He said, if that cowboy of yours ever rides back into town, don't let pride keep you from happiness a second time." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I didn't think you'd ever come back. But I did," Levi said softly. "And I'm not riding away again unless you tell me to." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, then leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss that held both the sweetness of memory and the promise of a future. When they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead against his. "Stay," she whispered. "Help me run this ranch. Build a life with me." Levi's answer was another kiss, deeper this time, sealing a promise 5 years in the making. 2 weeks later, Charlotte stood on the loading platform at the Billings cattle auction, watching as the auctioneer called out bids for her herd. Beside her stood Levi, his arm healed enough that he'd discarded the bandage, though he still favored it slightly. $3 a head, the auctioneer called. "Do I hear $3.25? The bidding continued, climbing steadily as buyers recognized the quality of the Blackwood cattle. When the final gavel fell, Charlotte's herd had fetched nearly $4 a head, well above the market average, and more than enough to secure the ranch's future. "Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood," the auction manager said, handing her a bank draft. "One of the best prices we've seen this season." Charlotte tucked the draft into her reticule, a weight lifting from her shoulders. With this money, she could hire more hands, rebuild the burned barn, and still have enough to see the ranch through the winter. As they walked toward the hotel where they would spend the night before returning to Sweetwater Creek, Levi took her hand. "How does it feel to be a successful cattle baroness?" he asked with a smile. "Exhausting," she admitted, "but good, very good." That evening, they dined in the hotel restaurant, celebrating their success with a bottle of champagne. Charlotte wore a green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her honey-colored hair arranged in an elegant updo. Across the table, Levi couldn't take his eyes off her. "You're staring," she observed, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm admiring," he corrected. "There's a difference." Charlotte smiled, twirling the stem of her champagne glass between her fingers. "I was thinking about what happens next, after we get back to the ranch." "What would you like to happen next?" Levi asked, his voice soft. She met his eyes, her expression serious but tender. "I'd like to start over, Levi. Not forget the past, but build something new on its foundation." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "I'd like to court properly this time. No rushing, no riding away." Levi turned his hand to clasp hers. "I'd like that too, and I promise you, Charlotte Blackwood, I'm not going anywhere." The autumn of 1880 painted the hills around Sweetwater Creek in shades of gold and crimson. Under Charlotte's direction, and with Levi's help, the Blackwood Ranch thrived. The north barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. Miguel recovered from his wounds and returned to his duties as foreman, now assisted by Charlie, who had proven himself during the confrontation with the rustlers. As for the Blackwood brothers, they were serving 10-year sentences in Deer Lodge Penitentiary for cattle rustling and attempted murder. Their threats no longer cast a shadow over Charlotte's future. True to his word, Levi courted Charlotte properly through the late summer and into fall. They rode together in the evenings, dined by candlelight, and sometimes simply sat on the porch swing, talking until the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. He told her of his years away the cattle drives, the business he'd built, the loneliness that had never quite left him. She shared stories of her life with Henry, the ranch, her dreams for the future. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt the bond that had begun in their youth, now strengthened by maturity and shared experience. On a crisp October evening, Levi took Charlotte on a picnic to a hillside overlooking the ranch. The valley spread out below them, the buildings small in the distance, cattle dotting the pastures like dark stones on a green carpet. "It's beautiful," Charlotte said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as the breeze picked up. "Sometimes I still can't believe it's mine." "You've earned it," Levi replied, pouring her a cup of coffee from a thermos. "Every acre." She accepted the coffee gratefully, warming her hands on the cup. "We've earned it. I couldn't have saved the ranch without you, Levi. You would have found a way. You're the strongest person I know, Charlotte Blackwood." She smiled at that, looking out over the landscape. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't ridden away all those years ago?" Levi considered the question. "Sometimes, but I don't think we would have appreciated what we have now if we hadn't lived those separate lives." He looked at her, his expression earnest. "I needed to become the man I am today, the man who could be a true partner to you, not just a lovesick boy with dreams bigger than his pockets." Charlotte nodded slowly. "And I needed to become this version of myself. Henry gave me that gift in his way. He taught me about ranching, about business. He gave me confidence. Then I'm grateful to him," Levi said sincerely, "for taking care of you when I couldn't, for helping you become the woman sitting beside me now." Charlotte's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That's a generous way to look at it. It's the truth." Levi set down his coffee cup and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Which brings me to why I asked you here today." Charlotte's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect pearl. "I know it hasn't been quite a year since Henry passed," Levi said softly. "And if you need more time, I understand, but I wanted you to know that whenever you're ready, this belongs to you." He took the ring from its box. "I bought this in Sweetwater Creek the day before you married Henry. I was going to ask you to run away with me, but I arrived too late." Charlotte stared at the ring, then at him, her eyes wide. "You've kept it all this time?" Levi nodded. "I couldn't bear to part with it. It represented everything I wanted but couldn't have." He held it out to her. "Now it represents everything I hope we can build together." Tears spilled onto Charlotte's cheeks as she extended her left hand. "I don't need more time, Levi. I've waited 5 years for you to come home to me." Levi slipped the ring onto her finger, his own eyes damp. "Is that a yes, Charlotte Blackwood?" In answer, she leaned forward and kissed him, her arms twining around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes." They were married on Christmas Eve in the parlor of the ranch house, with Miguel, Charlie, and the rest of the hands in attendance. Charlotte wore a gown of ivory satin and carried a bouquet of winter greenery tied with a ribbon that had once belonged to her mother. Levi, dressed in a new black suit, watched her walk toward him with wonder in his eyes, scarcely able to believe that the moment he had dreamed of for so long had finally arrived. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying through the festively decorated room. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As they exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish one another for all their days, Levi thought of the winding path that had led them to this moment. The young cowboy who had ridden away with a broken heart could never have imagined that, 5 years later, he would return to find not just the woman he loved, but a partnership that would define the rest of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, closing his Bible with a smile. "You may kiss your bride." Levi drew Charlotte into his arms, kissing her as cheers erupted around them. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and breathless, he whispered against her ear, "Welcome home, Mrs. Morgan." "I've been home since the day you rode back into Sweetwater Creek," she replied, her eyes shining with happiness. "I just didn't know it yet." That night, as snow fell gently outside the windows of their bedroom, Levi and Charlotte began their life together as husband and wife. Their passion, long restrained by propriety and circumstance, finally found expression in tender caresses and whispered words of love. In each other's arms, they discovered a homecoming more profound than either had dared to hope for. Spring came early to Montana in 1881, bringing with it new life to the ranch. Calves frolicked in the pastures, wildflowers carpeted the hillsides, and Charlotte Morgan moved through it all with a secret smile that grew more pronounced as the days lengthened. One evening in April, as she and Levi sat on the porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the mountains, she took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes luminous in the fading light. Levi looked from his hand to her face, understanding dawning slowly. "Charlotte, are you?" She nodded, her smile radiant. "Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby in October." Joy unlike anything Levi had ever known washed through him. He gathered Charlotte into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." Charlotte laughed, the sound like music in the quiet evening, the beginning of our family. As they sat together, planning and dreaming of the future that stretched before them, Levi thought of all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment. The heartbreak of watching Charlotte marry another, the years of separation, the grief that had eventually led to reunion, all of it had been necessary to forge the bond they now shared. He had ridden away once, believing he had lost her forever. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The cowboy had found his lady a widow, but his heart had remained constant through it all. And now, as the stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, that heart was finally, completely home.